All right, so training camp is here and in effect. We got the preseason coming up, Tyler, and I would say right now is the time where you adjust the rankings the most, right? Like we had all our offseason stuff. We have our rankings out. You can get our rankings, both of our rankings, if you visit our pages and take a look in the description. But when it comes to rankings, I think right now is a good time to maybe take a deeper look because it's the first part of season, of preseason, first part of training camp. New roles are here. People are, we're kind of seeing things for the first time, even though a lot of it was in shorts. We're seeing pads for the first time. It's going to be a good time to see offenses, their first game in preseason. So I don't know how you typically move, Tyler. Like with me personally, I normally don't put a whole lot of stock into like preseason numbers or like the training camp coach speak. How are you looking at like the off season before games start when it comes to like moving up and down your rankings? Is that something you typically do?
So, and not so much right now. I kind of just wait a little bit. But I make note of it, right? Because last year you had, a lot of people didn't pay. I don't want to say pay attention, but it's really hard to differentiate coach speak from like actual what's going to really happen. So a guy last year, Puka Nakua, obviously blew up, but he was talked about a lot by a lot of the beat reporters as a standout in camp. So you need to make note of it, and start to adjust your draft board. But for me, I don't want to say it's too early. Like we're getting close to drafts. If you have a draft coming up, yeah. But I won't really do it until probably more next week. Give it one more week because it's starting to hit the middle of camp. The pads just came on, which is really important. So I'm gonna wait like one more week to really start really like moving a couple of these guys around. But it's definitely something that needs to be in the back of your head, and you need to be aware about a lot of the news that's happening right now.
Yeah, and I tend not to like overreact too. I'm the same way. Try not to
Yeah,
overreact, but it really is time to like dial in. You keep hearing this name. You keep hearing
yeah.
he's associated with the first team. You keep hearing the beat writers say he's an important part of the offense. It's like you have to acknowledge that a player that did that a couple years ago that I have learned since then is Isaiah Pacheco. And it was like, hey,
Mhm.
this seventh rounder, I think he was undrafted or seventh rounder at the time. It was like, hey, this guy's making noise in camp. I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. He ended up being the guy that took over. So I think there's some credence to it, but
But on the flip side, I do want to say this too, because I don't remember if you remember Marquez Callaway. Do you remember him for
oh
the
yeah,
Saints? He was the talk of camp, and I moved him pretty high in my rankings, and man, that was a fat L. So on the yes, you do want to be paying attention. You just got to kind of pick out like what's noise and what's true. So it can be
yeah.
hard at times.
It can, but that's what our job is, right? And it's
Yeah.
we also got to take a look at these rankings. So far in training camp, obviously there's been a lot of standouts. If you go on Twitter, you go on, anybody's fantasy page, you're going to be hearing about these training camp updates. Give me one player that's been kind of moving up your board, not just because of coach speak, not just because of play, but maybe you thought, you know what, I had this guy a little bit lower in my rankings. I want to put him higher.
So it's not so much I had him lower my rankings, but it's Chase Brown. Like there's always so this was one of the big battles to watch out for in training camp. And by the early reports, I haven't really seen a whole lot since, and we'll get more as it advances into preseason. But
Yeah.
he's been running with the first team. He's looked explosive. He's had some big runs during camp. And this is kind of what you want to see. You want to start to see these guys differentiate themselves a little bit in these backfields where we're not really sure who's going to be the guy. And training camp will kind of tell us, but also so will preseason. So he's a guy that I'm starting to move up my board because I was already pretty high on him. He was going later, but I do feel like the drum beat will get louder and louder, and these guys will get pushed up more and more up the board. So it kind of depends on where he ends up capping out. But he's a guy I'm slowly kind of moving up my draft board because I was already pretty high on him as well.
Yeah, but so when it comes to like roles, obviously you're here like first team, right? One of the counters I would give you on that is maybe Zach Moss because he's newer. The team didn't want to automatically put him over a guy that they had in their locker room last season. Maybe he needs to learn the offense a little bit more, or maybe he's going to be used in different situations. Does that affect how high you're moving him up, or are you paying more attention to like, nah, he's getting the reps that I want to see, and he's involved in the offense the way that I want to see it?
No, absolutely. Like he's brand new to the team. That stuff, is obviously in the back of my, and that's why I wait a little bit. Like we want to see with the new players that are being acclimated into these teams. Yeah, there was OTAs and all that kind of stuff, but the pads are actually on now. This is the meaningful time of the year. What's happening? So I still like, I don't know if these guys are going to end up playing in preseason. I don't know who ends up playing really.
Yeah.
So as long as they're playing in preseason and we start to see kind of like what's the split between these two guys, it's going to be important for the rankings going forward. But I just was not super high on Zach Moss to begin with. And this is, I don't want to say confirming what I already thought, but it's starting to just start to like, I don't want to say make, you know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah,
don't want
yeah,
to
yeah.
make it sound like I know what I'm talking
And that's
about, but
part
it's
of what this
confirming a
does.
little
Like
bit. Yeah.
it gives you a little bit more of like, all right, now I have a little bit firmer ground to stand on. Like now you're
Yeah.
like, okay, it's starting to play out the
But
way
it's
that I
early
thought.
still. It's still a
Right.
little early, and I just want to give a little bit more time until you really start adjusting that stuff. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, a player that's for me has kind of done the same thing is just in a different way. I was higher on Javonte Williams than a lot of people, right? A lot of people coming off the ACL last year saw him and they're like, does he still have it? He didn't play as well as far as efficiency wise down the stretch as we had hoped, but he was also coming off of a major injury. So I thought, this is a guy we were taking as potentially a top 10 to 12 running back a couple years ago. Not much has changed with him outside of the injury. So he still played violent last year. He's with the coach and Sean Payton, who does like to use his running backs. But we've also heard a lot of offseason talk, and this kind of gives credence to what we were talking about with those running backs that come out of nowhere. Audric Estime has had a role in this offense too. I called him Audric Estime, and they went crazy on me because I said Audric Estime. So Estime, right? We got it right this time. But to me, Javonte Williams is a dog, and he's been getting a lot of first-team reps. So for me, that's encouraging to see, especially with the team looking like they're going to go with the vets early. It looks like Bo Nix and Zach Wilson probably going to be the backups here, and Jared Stidham has the early lead there. But I like Javonte Williams. And the thing is, they use him as a pass catcher. He could be used in the trenches. The team's probably not going to score a lot, but he's going to be their red zone guy as well. So I don't know if we're going to get a full workload because of guys like Chase McLaughlin there in the background. We got Audric Estime. So who knows what that whole thing looks like? Or excuse me, Jaleel McLaughlin. But at the same time, Javonte Williams is a guy that I feel very good about getting him as like my running back 3. I think he could be
Yeah.
a really good backup running back to have and potentially have flex value throughout the season at least.
No, absolutely. And he was somebody that, and in recent drafts, has really fallen down the board a little bit too. Like he was going in like round, like with all those rumors kind of coming out, he
They
was
said he
going
was
in
a
like
cut
round.
candidate.
Yeah, he was going in like round 8 and stuff. So he'll probably move up a little bit, but I agree with you. Like all the word out of camp from everybody is that he looks much better, which you had to think was going to happen this year too. Just that was a really bad injury he was coming off of. It wasn't just a regular ACL tear. I think he tore like everything in his knee.
Yeah,
So
MCL, PCL,
it
everything.
was a significant injury for, so yeah, I agree with that. A player that I'm liking as well, I kind of liked him, but by all reports as well, been really good, and that's Curtis Samuel. And why I like Curtis Samuel is because he's produced fantasy numbers now, not high-end fantasy numbers, but he averaged over 14 fantasy points per game a few years ago with Joe Brady, the current offense coordinator there. He was offense coordinator in Carolina, and they're moving him around right now as well, which I don't want to say he's Debo because nobody's Debo, but he does, like we've seen him in different offenses move around the offense and be kind of more of a playmaker than just your regular wide receiver lining up. Like he'll get run out of the backfield. So he's dynamic in that regard where they'll use him in different ways. And that's been one of the big things that they've said. A lot of these beat reporters have been saying in camp where he's lining up in the backfield. He's going short. He's going deep. So they're using him a bunch of different ways. And once again, like we've seen him produce in fantasy. That's why I like him more than a guy like Khalil Shakir, where I do think that he could be a really solid target at the, round 10-ish is kind of where he's going.
Yeah, and especially because we know he's going to be more of a volume guy, right? A guy around the line of scrimmage for the most part. Obviously, you said they're taking shots with him deep, but this is a player who, I mean, he has like wide receiver 3 type floor when he's active, and to be the number 1 target, presumably in this offense, he's got a lot of room to spare. Everybody was so worried about the vacated targets on this team, man, with Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis gone, and automatically assumed that Dalton Kincaid's going to be the major beneficiary of it. But it was like when they drafted Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel, I was like, man, there's a lot of room for these receivers, and Josh Allen likes throwing to his receivers as well. So I love that pick there, Curtis Samuel. Another player who's kind of going up my rankings right now, already had been, but George Pickens. And the concern with George Pickens obviously is like, this is an Arthur Smith offense. He's super inconsistent, things like that. The team drafted Roman Wilson in the 3rd round or 4th round. I can't remember the pick, man.
Third round, I think.
Third round, yeah. I thought I had it. But Roman Wilson, obviously, and then he goes down, right? So you look at who's next in line. The team signed Van Jefferson, who's the number 2 receiver right now, who should be decent, nothing really a threat. You also have Calvin Austin, who's on the team, and then Cordero Patterson, who's probably going to play a flex role between receiver, running back, and then special teams. So where does that leave George Pickens with 2 quarterbacks, whoever it is, Russell Wilson, who's presumably going to be the starter, or Justin Fields, say it happens later in the year? Both like to throw the deep ball to a deep ball merchant, a guy who likes to get the deep ball. Plus, they're moving him around in the formation, putting him in the slot. And they're going to take shots with him in the red zone. To me, this screams like breakout season, mega season for George Pickens, who's typically going outside of the top 25, 30 receivers, depending on your league style. I think this could be a crazy year for George Pickens. And who had, I mean, that's saying that coming from a guy who had 1,100 yards last season with Kenny Pickett, Mason Rudolph. And I'm like, there's 1,300 yard potential here, bro. Seriously, I really think that. So he's definitely coming up my board right now.
No, for sure. And I love George. I'm a Steelers fan, so I'm a bit biased. And I talked about this in one of my recent videos where it's like when I'm on the clock, for me personally, how I play fantasy is I'm shooting for the moon with like all my picks. I don't care about floor. I'm shooting for the moon. And when I look at like currently where he's going is around like T. Higgins. When I look at him and T. Higgins, who do I think could potentially be top 5? In no world do I think T. Higgins, if Jamar Chase is there, can be top 5. Right. George Pickens, maybe. So I really like that one as well. It'll be interesting to see how the quarterback situation plays out too, just because Russell Wilson is, I don't know if he came back. I know he's back, but he wasn't participating in actual team because he wasn't quite ready. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but it'll be interesting.
Fields look good too.
Yeah, so it'll be
from all reports, he's looked good.
It'll be interesting to see how that quarterback battle plays out there. The next guy that I want to talk about, there's going to be 2 guys, and because it's just early, and I want to see how this plays out, is Jalen Polk, who I wasn't that high on coming into the season, just because he never commanded a lot of targets, a high target share in college, and for me, that's kind of one thing that I really look at is wide receivers that command targets. Now, you could say, well, because he was playing with Rome Odunze, who Rome is just an absolute stud. Like, I think Rome could be maybe the best top 2 wide receivers in the draft class, which is the top 3 guys, absolute studs. Like, these could be superstar players. So I really like Rome, and maybe Rome just kind of, ate into the workload a little bit too much for Jalen Polk, who by all reports in Patriots training camp has been really spectacular. Also another guy, though, I do want to mention because I like this guy because he saw a high college target share, and that's Javon Baker. He's also been making some plays in training camp. So guys that really in your fantasy drafts may go undrafted in a lot of leagues, but in your 12 teams plus, they're going to be late round guys that are typically going in like rounds 15, 14 to drafts that you're just throwing dart throws. And why I like these guys and kind of moving them up is because I'm a big fan of Drake May. I don't know if he's going to start right away, but potentially later in the season. And there's nobody else here. Yes, this offense is not going to be very good, most likely, but you're talking about somebody in this wide receiver room just needs to see some targets. And these are 2 guys that are rookie wide receivers. We don't know what the true upside is. Do I think that they're going to be the next Puka Nacua? Probably not. But could they be, maybe Jaden Reed-esque, where they're just outside the top 25, maybe 30, wide receiver 30 in like a keeper league? Maybe you could keep them as well. So these are guys that are kind of moving on my draft board, especially Jalen Polk a little bit.
I have concern about that Patriots receiver room, but sometimes that's where we find value, man, where there's not just a clear-cut guy. Like, Kendrick Bourne's probably going to be coming back from his injury. The team signed KJ Osborne. You got, Jalen Polk and Javon Baker. Obviously, Hunter Henry's in the fold, and Jacoby Brissett, for all intents and purposes, is not going to beat his 4,000-yard passer. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out with the receiving core there. But you mentioned the next year's Jaden Reed. You mentioned this year's Jaden Reed. What about last year's Jaden Reed and actually Jaden Reed, man? Because this is a player, man, Matt LaFleur has come out and said, we want him to be our number 1 guy. And to me, that was clear and evident towards the second half of last year, where over the last 7 games of the year, he was a top 10 guy. So I think Jaden Reed, assuming this number 1 receiver role, speaks volumes for a guy that's going outside the top 35 receivers in most drafts right now. To get a number 1 receiver on a prolific offense right now is crazy. And the hype all offseason, who's it been about on this Green Bay Packers team? Dontavian Wicks, and how he's efficient, how he's going to get open. What about Jaden Reed, the guy who was actually performing, and then the coach is sitting there saying, hey, this is our player. This is our number 1. So Romeo Doubs has also been a starter, and there's been a lot of questions and concerns about the hierarchy of this Green Bay Packer offense.
Mhm.
Christian Watson went to the doctor and got his other leg checked out and evened out. So now things are good on his end. But when I look at this hierarchy, to know that there's 4 talented receivers there and Jaden Reed is the first player that's going to be off, that's off the board in this offense, I think it's time to move him up and recognize that he really could be probably more so like a top 25 receiver than outside of the top 35.
Oh man, you're sleeping. You're already sleeping. I already have him ranked in my top 25.
Oh,
This
so
is
yeah,
he's
yeah.
gonna break out, man. Well, not break out. He already broke out. Like I agree with that take a lot because he's a player that I like Matt Harmon a lot. I think Matt Harmon does great work in reception perception. His profile was absolutely excellent coming out of college. It was really good as well. He was an underrated wide receiver, and then last year just confirmed everything. So I think that's a really good one. I agree with that.
Yeah, there's a lot, man. Obviously, we have a lot of time with training camp in the preseason, but it is always important to note, and then also not overreact to a couple
Yeah.
injuries on the injury front. Justin Herbert's going to be out for 2 to 3 weeks, so don't be overly concerned about that. He should be good to go for the regular season, even though he's in a boot. You'll see that, but he should be fine for the regular season. And then it was announced that DeAndre Hopkins is going to miss about 4 to 6 weeks with an injury as well. So that puts him right at the start of the season. Let's get confirmation on how he's doing in his recovery before we adjust Calvin Ridley to the moon, like I'm assuming it's going to happen again. And then also we got to get an update on Geno Smith, who left training camp as well with an injury, getting a look at his knee and his hip. See you in that Seahawks jersey before we start to react on JSN, DK Metcalf. We need to make sure those guys are cool.